Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of AP US History. I am Mr. Langella. So guys, today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the effects of Cold War policy on the world, and we're going to kind of key in on specific areas that really were affected by Truman's policies. And just to kind of give us a quick little refresher, and I'll be very brief just because the video last time was pretty long. Last time we were here, we talked about really the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then basically after World War II had ended, the fear of communism spreading to the United States had increased and actually jump-started the first Red Scare, which we talked about in Unit 7. But now, this is now growing these tensions between us and USSR, to the point where we ended up having a strategy to kind of halt the spread of communism using the alliance between us and other westernized nations. Because once we started to see satellite states started to form in the USSR region or the Eastern Europe, we realized that this was going to be a long battle, and not necessarily a battle between us and USSR, but it would end up being a kind of competition, a proxy war to see who can out strengthen the other, who could expand their influence compared to the other. And we were now in a complete competition between the two, and we started to use our strategy of what we call containment, an idea of trying to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union and communism into other regions. And we kind of saw this with the two plans, whether it was the Truman Doctrine or the Marshall Plan, which had basically gave a lot of money out to westernized nations to help combat against the Soviet Union and the expansion of communism. We saw that this was a major impact in the United States because, first off, the Western Europe had become strong by 1950, but the United States had gained a lot of money through exports that they were sending through other nations. But the problem is that this had increased tensions between us and the USSR, and we now see the battle lines being drawn between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which was now having a divided world between who is for communism and who is against it. And this all culminates into the arms race, which is a competition between us and the USSR of who can gain the most power using a stockpiling of weapons. And we would now combat each other through what we call proxy wars, not necessarily us fighting one another, but us really influencing another nation fighting each other. So, for instance, we'll go into some examples goes with that. But here are the impacts of our policy on the rest of the world. So firstly, let's take a look at Japan. Now, the interesting thing about Japan, and I actually took a very in-depth class about the history of Japan from these origins all the way to modern day when I was a young strapping college student. But let me explain to you some very interesting information. Firstly, when the war had ended, the United States had occupied Japan, and 7 of the top generals were executed or tried for war crimes and then were executed, which now means that the nationalist groups that were kind of taking over Japan will now be out of control. Okay, and basically now the job of the United States was to basically reconstruct Japan from scratch under the leadership of MacArthur, basically first by creating a brand new constitution which would prioritize a republic, a parliamentary democracy, and then have us basically limit the amount of military that they have and use America as almost the security force of Japan. Basically what we told Japan was, hey guys, you're not going to have a military anymore. We will be your military. The only thing you need to focus on is developing your economic power and becoming a very strong trading partner so that we could then become very good bros when it comes to the trading markets. And that's basically what Japan ends up doing. But basically what we do is we want to prioritize making Japan almost like a westernized ally by helping us combat communism, especially since China is a growing force in the East. So we basically end our occupation of Japan a little bit later on, but basically we want to make sure that they surrender the Korea islands and also the other specific islands that they had taken over during World War II. Now, when we look at the other portions of the East and also in the Pacific, we prioritize giving the Philippines their independence July 4th, 1946, and we regain a lot of our naval bases so we do not lose out on everything that we had gained for the Philippines. The biggest thing is going to be when it comes to China. Now, China is in a civil war from 1946 to 1952, and this civil war is basically a fight between nationalists, which are trying to suppress communism, and those communist forces. So the United States had sent basically $400 million in support of the nationalists. But the problem is that due to a lot of corruption, 80% of the money goes into the hands of the communist control. And ends up happening is China, the Republic of China, which is the communist regime led by Mao Zedong, had controlled most of the mainland and basically had pushed the nationalists all the way to Taiwan. Now, because of this majority of control, Mao Zedong ends up becoming basically the leader of China, and we don't really recognize China for many, many years as being a communist state, but they ended up really solidifying their control when they signed the Sino-Soviet Pact in 1950, which is a small alliance or a non-aggression agreement between them and the USSR. And here's a cartoon, a painting of Stalin and Mao Zedong, which show this kind of, not saying they're pals, but it's very similar to the Hitler-Stalin agreement, the non-aggression pact, right? And that's really that they will agree to not kill each other. And that's kind of a very big deal because this was a very big loss to the United States. China is a very strong, growing nation, and now that they have fallen to communism, is now going to kind of shed light on really some of the failures that we've had. But the next big thing is going to be the Korean War. Now, Korea was divided between two separate areas: the North, which was Soviet protected, and the South, which is United States supported. And this was jump-started after the defeat of Japan, and Japan had kind of relinquished the Korean land, basically had relinquished control of it. But now, what ends up happening is this division between the two, the communists versus the United States supported, the Democratic, they end up getting into a civil war of sorts. Now, in June 25th, 1950, North Korea has invaded South Korea, and now the United States has to kind of jumpstart some aid, or really try to push to help South Korea win this fight. So what they do is they go to the UN, and they basically had pleaded to have the UN send forces to help aid South Korea, and that's what happens. The UN sends forces, and the majority of the forces are United States forces, but it was led by Douglas MacArthur because he was the supreme commander of the UN military forces. And the reason why that the Congress was on board with this is that we had painted it as being a police action, not necessarily a war effort. Now, this basically when we had sent the UN forces into Korea, we had actually pushed the North Koreans all the way back, almost to China. And this was actually very successful. But unfortunately, the Chinese forces end up sending a counter force to attack us, to kind of basically push us back to the 38th parallel. Now, basically, when you look at the Korean War, this ends up ultimately having almost like a stalemate, where basically we have a ceasefire, and the battle ends with the 38th. Really, the line of the 38th parallel will be divided between North and South Korea. So obviously, when you look at this as a quick run, the United Nations had forced North Koreans back, but then the Chinese had forced the UN forces to go back, and now we are at a stalemate. Now, this looks like a major failure for the United States because obviously MacArthur is a prominent general, and obviously we looked weak because we couldn't get the communists out of North Korea. So we end up firing MacArthur, and this division between Truman and MacArthur becomes very politicized. And basically, a lot of people back home looked at MacArthur as being a hero because of his ideas during World War II and his concept of containment and all this stuff. So Truman ends up losing a lot of his political sway when it comes to the any sort of bills that he wants to push forward. Now, what ends up happening is when you look at the result of this Korean conflict, we end up starting peace talks in 1951. It finally is signed in 1953, keeping the separation between North and South Korea at the 38th parallel. Okay. Now, when you look at the results, 2.5 million deaths had occurred. 54,000 were United States soldiers. But some positives you can take away from this was that the new technology of the B-52 jet bomber was developed during this conflict. We see the new policy of containment in technically, it did work. When you look at the concept of containment, we wanted to stop North Korea from the communist regime from expanding. And originally, their idea was they wanted to expand into South Korea. But we did stop them from doing so. Granted, we wanted to kick the North Koreans out of North Korea, the communists out of North Korea, but we did contain their expansion. So the idea of using this containment policy did sort of work. But the problem is that we didn't really fulfill our full desires. Now, what the other effect of this is that there was going to be a lot of political division between Democrats and Republicans going forward when it comes to the how we're going to handle communism and how we're going to tackle this problem. Now we're going to analyze really the impact of the Cold War policies on the home front and how it leads into the second Red Scare. Okay, so when you look at how overseas, all this stuff's going on, we're trying to contain communism at its peak. We're trying to make sure it doesn't spread. But the problem is that there's still a lot of paranoia going on back in the United States. And what ends up happening is we start to really develop the Smith Act, which goes against really is illegals who advocate upheaval. And this was created in the 1940s. And one of the big cases that kind of jumpstarts really is shown in the limelight during this time was the Dennis versus the United States, where basically the Communist Party was trying to advocate for the overthrow of the government, and basically this law was tested in the Supreme Court, and it was shown that obviously the Dennis was put in jail because of the fact that he was advocating for overthrow of the United States government, and this kind of does limit free speech to a certain degree, especially since during this era where, we're in war, okay? Now, this only gets worse and worse as we continue closer throughout the Cold War itself. Now, the McCarran Internal Security Act in 1950 basically makes it illegal to support establishment of totalitarian governments. Basically, if you were in support of these communist leaders abroad seas, you could, you could basically be put in prison. You could restrict the employment of people that were a part of these parties, and then you could even create detention camps for those that were involved in like the Communist Party or other groups that were trying to subvert the United States government or trying to advocate for the strengthening of the communist regimes. So this was kind of clearly a check against civil rights of people. I mean, granted, you may not agree with a lot of the actions of this Communist Party, and you may hate communists, and that's completely fine. But when you look at this as a whole, you have to understand that this is still limiting free speech. I mean, that's the one thing that's different between the United States and other nations is that in the United States, you're allowed to really say a lot of things that you probably wouldn't be allowed to say in other places. And this was kind of bordering on that line of we're limiting what people may say or petition or protest. And that's kind of the overarching thing. Now, these paranoias end up leading into a lot of espionage cases, and I'll kind of focus in on two specific ones. So the first one was going to be along with Alger Hiss, who was a State Department official. He was accused of being part of the communist spy ring and was sent to this group called the Un-American Activities Committee. Now, this is going to be really important, all right? The Un-American Activities Committee basically is a committee of House members that were investigating the involvement of spies in the United States and their allegiance to the USSR. And basically, this is going to kind of jumpstart a large witch hunt that ends up kind of expanding throughout the United States. So Alger Hiss basically was accused of being a communist, and basically when they brought to this committee, they were now investigating Alger Hiss as being a spy. And the interesting thing was he was being prosecuted by Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon basically makes a name for himself during these espionage cases and becomes a very big political figure. Now, Alger Hiss was convicted of perjury and was never convicted of any sort of spy activity. But then you take a look at the next investigation, which is, if it really started first, of Klaus Fuchs, which is a British scientist who actually was found to be, he worked under the Manhattan Project, he actually was found in giving information of how to develop the atom bomb to the Soviets. So when they had investigated Klaus, they had found that there was actually a Russian spy ring within the United States that was actually feeding information to the USSR, and two specific individuals that they had found to be part of the spy ring was Saul and Ethel Rosenberg. And they were found of treason and were executed. But the big impact, you have to understand, was with this investigation. Now, when you look at the Alger Hiss one, there really wasn't a lot of information that really can go along with this. But the fact that they had found there was a spy ring within the United States that was feeding information to the USSR, this had jump-started an era of paranoia and fear. And basically, this is going to cause everyone to turn on one another to see who is a spy, who is working for the USSR. And this is really causes the rise of Joseph McCarthy. Now, Joseph McCarthy is a Republican of Wisconsin, and basically he had used the fight against communism as a way for him to get reelected, and he basically had become the poster child of anti-communism investigations. And basically what he wanted to do was he painted himself as being this hero, and he targeted really the federal government and a lot of the Truman administration as being aides to this Soviet to the Soviet Union. And basically what he was trying to do was go after a lot of the political opponents that he did not like. And he basically was using no evidence whatsoever to try to go after these people. He used very aggressive tactics. He basically was badgering witnesses left and right. And some people were really on his side for a while, but his tactics really started to grow old. I mean, at the end of the day, he really had no evidence to back anything he was saying, and he was just basically using paranoia to get people to jump on his side. Now, when you look at the Army McCarthy hearings, basically these were televised events where basically he was going after individuals he deemed to be part of the USSR spy ring. And basically these were televised witch hunts, if you were to call it that, because the reality is these were bogus. There was nothing that actually, no evidence to back any of the claims he was making. He was just basically spouting a lot of, falsehoods, and people started to kind of catch in on that. I mean, Margaret Smith, which is a member of Congress, had basically said a declaration of conscience, which basically called for the re-examining of the tactics he was using to kind of shed light on that, maybe this paranoia that we're all going through right now is really a horrible way of going about investigating any sort of real spying going on. Because at the end of the day, we're using fears to basically, investigate people that really have nothing to do with it. And it was shown that honestly McCarthy was going after political opponents to try to increase his political symbol, his political status, really. I was trying to find the best word. And once he was found to be basically full of it, they had discredited McCarthy's actions, discredited his tactics, and they censured McCarthy. Now, when you look at a censure, basically it's like a slap on the wrist. It's almost like having a bad mark on your report card. But basically he was looked at as being a nuts individual from here on out. And 3 years later, weirdly enough, he had died a broken man. He basically had passed away, and he was basically a shell of himself, because a lot of people now look at McCarthy as being a fool, really, somebody that was just someone that was trying to increase his political status by going after everyone else. And when you look at the Salem witch trials, right, the play and the movie and all that stuff, it was kind of actually mirrored after McCarthy's hearings, basically where he was just threatening every political opponent on the planet that he had, and using no evidence whatsoever, was trying to basically put them in prison for being a part of this spy ring that he had no evidence to prove. But when you take a look at the Truman era legacy, and this is kind of how we'll finish the video, we really have to analyze kind of how he tackled communism. And we'll first start with his early policies of containment. And, how effective were they? Some people were looking at it as being, well, when you look at Korea, he did contain the communist regime from expanding, but in certain cases, he did fail. China did fall into communism hands, and that is a very large power that is now on the communist side. Same thing could be said about with how Truman had handled Greece, and Turkey. How did he handle those actions? Did he suppress the spread of communism? So we see that whether or not he was effective at really containing communism going forward. We also analyzed the arms race. The fact that we were now in a competition between us and the Soviet Union, was it successful? Was he able to kind of show that he was expanding American military power by also not being to be too aggressive? Then we analyzed really the first proxy war of Korea, right? I kind of mentioned this before. How effective was it at containing the issues, really containing communism from expanding? And then lastly, civil rights. How do we really look at Truman as saying we started to really restrict a lot of policies, or really a lot of rights of individuals because of this fear of communism spreading? And this ended up leading right into the Red Scare. under Truman, the Red Scare does occur, and we kind of analyze the fact on whether or not he did an effective enough job at really halting the paranoia that was emerging during this time period. And you can kind of be positive or negative toward Truman. A lot of historians kind of point to him as being that middle figure, like somebody that did do a little bit of both. He was successful in some facets, but he also did fail in others. But he also understand that he was also the one that ended the war. So people kind of look at Truman as being that interesting figure there. Alrighty, well, that's going to be it for us today. We're going to continue with section 2, which is the Eisenhower years. We finish off with Truman, and we're going to stop there today. All right, guys, that's it for me. Langella out.